Hello everyone! Welcome back to our classical music improvisation channel. I'm Robert and today I'm excited to share my interview with guitarist, lutenist and contrapuntist Max Fletcher. For me it was fascinating to hear his perspectives and how he journeyed from free improvisation to Renaissance counterpoint. Oh yeah, and if you're based in New York, you should definitely join Max's The Counterpoint project, a regular series of workshops for musicians interested in learning to improvise counterpoint via historically informed curricula. So thanks again, Max, and here we go.
How does improvisation play a role in your musicianship?
When I first became interested in early music, one of the reasons that I was so interested in it was because I observed through what I could kind of glean from learning more about the world and the way the musicians operated and the way that they played. What I was interested in was the way that musicians in earlier times had a very fluid relationship with the kind of musical material that they were working with. It was very easy for me to imagine a salon concert by some 15th or 16th Renaissance lutenist who would take a chanson and have a tenorist play the reduction of the lower voices and improvise a embellishment to the cantus part, and then take the subject of that chanson and ditch the tenorist and play a fantasia, an imitative fantasia using that as a subject, and then maybe take that subject and use it as, a set of further diminutions. And this kind of way of working with material and kind of processing it in these different ways and setting it up in different relationships, that was very attractive to me because it was very similar to the kind of contemporary improvisation that I was working with at the time when I was studying at the New England Conservatory. So that's the reason that I kind of got into early music, is because I wanted to kind of go back to the beginning of that. I wanted to understand where that came from and practice that using the same kind of materials that I understood those musicians to have been using.
Could you say a bit more? So you said that before on the modern guitars, now you play the lute. You did some contemporary improvisation, is that right? And how did you get into that, and what kind of things did you do?
Well, as a guitarist, I'm sorry to all the listeners who are guitarists out there, because I had sort of an interesting experience with the guitar where after a certain while I absolutely could not stand the sound of the guitar anymore. Which is maybe a common experience for anyone that plays an instrument. You play it for so long that eventually it just starts to kind of disgust you. But more than that, I was really tired and could not bring myself to keep working on the music that formed most of the classical guitar repertoire, which I felt was unfortunate for a number of different reasons that perhaps we don't have the chance to get into at the moment. But to make a long story short, I found my way into improvisation because I became inspired by a number of guitarists who used their guitars to make sounds that sounded absolutely nothing like a guitar. And after a couple of years in conservatory, I would say my interests completely bifurcated. I was very into music written before 1750, and I was very interested in music written after 1950. And I sort of stopped worrying about everything in between. And on the contemporary side of things, I spent a lot of time learning the contemporary classical guitar repertoire. I had the wonderful opportunity of actually studying with Elliott Fisk, who Luciano Berio wrote the guitar sequenza for, and so I got a chance to study the Berio sequenza with the person that it was written for. And along the same time, I was taking lessons and playing in ensembles with people whose entire musical life was all about free improvisation. And so those two streams, the early music and the contemporary improvisation, were very much interrelated for me. And when I was kind of in school and I was, tasked with figuring out the rest of my entire life, I thought, well, it would make a lot of sense to kind of go back in order to go forward. And so I kind of made it a long-term goal to take sort of a deep dive into the medieval and Renaissance and even early Baroque periods and understand how the improvised music in that time period worked, and with the conviction that doing so would provide me as a musician, as a performer, as a composer, as an improviser, with a sensibility and a set of skills and abilities that would be very applicable to any sort of modern aesthetic, or any aesthetic at all, for that matter.
And so how do you practice improvisation?
Well, I would kind of group it into two categories. There's the very kind of strict improvisation where you have an idea of the constraints and the kind of rules that you're setting up for yourself that are going to in some way dictate the sort of structured or prepared improvisation that you're about to do. And that can range anywhere from kind of hard counterpoint to playing around with pre-existing material in different ways. Like something that's very common in my practice is to be working on a piece of lute tablature, a lute solo, and to make part of my practicing of that piece picking out different parts of it and using those as the basis for improvisation. The second way, I would say, throws that all out the window and just kind of tries to exist in a more fluid space that is not necessarily being limited by those parameters at the outset. Well, I think that there's always going to be implicit parameters, physically speaking. I mean, the instrument that I'm holding in my hands, or the way that I'm holding that instrument, dictate to a large extent the spectrum of sounds that I'm capable of using. But I think that, sort of to what you said, the practice itself is allowing those things to come up. And I think that those things that come up are often very driven by the technique of the instrument that you're working with. It's in those moments that I think I actually make a lot of interesting discoveries about ways to play the instrument, because you're sort of putting yourself in a flow state where you're allowing, in some sense, the instrument to dictate the sound as opposed to the other way around.
If you meet hurdles in your improvisation practice, how do you get over these?
It's one of the most difficult parts about improvisation, and it's one of the things that I feel most grateful to have actually studied improvisation with people that had to deal with that bell 10 times a day for about 30 years. And they have amassed a lot of tricks to push yourself past that. And there are many different ways to go about doing that. I think what I have found the most effective or the most helpful in my own practice in the past has been simplifying. has been restricting the scope of what you are allowing yourself to kind of take on, and trying to do more with less and really explore all the different possibilities and all the different combinations of things when you're working in that more restricted kind of musical space, and you don't feel so overwhelmed by the infinite world of sound, which I think is one of the big contributors to that sense of I don't know where to go from here.
Why do you improvise?
It's a fabulous question. I remember when I was in school, we had a performance class, and the professor once asked the student that was playing, "Why do you play guitar?" And it was like full on, like deer in the headlights. The train was coming full speed ahead. They couldn't get out of the way. They had never asked themselves that question, and it was a very important moment for that student, I think, to be faced with that. So I think those kinds of super basic fundamental questions seem a little bit funny on the outset, but I think that I improvise because it feels good. I think that there's all manner of sort of academic or intellectual or scholastic reasons that I could give for improvisation as a study and as a historical or as a contemporary practice, and all of the musical nuances that go into that, and all of the aesthetic and relational things. But as a fundamental thing, I think it's very satisfying. It's very pleasing. It's a way of exploring yourself, a way of exploring the relationship with your instrument and the sound that it can create, and whatever kinds of aesthetic worlds you're working in. That's what I would say. It's a mode of exploration.
Thank you so much.